In the heart of Tokyo, beneath the golden autumn sky of October 2019, two of the world's most ancient monarchies were about to intersect in a ceremony that would bridge thousands of years of tradition with the urgent demands of modern global politics. Prince Charles, heir to the British throne for over 5 decades, stepped from his official car onto Japanese soil, carrying with him not just the weight of royal protocol, but the hopes of a nation seeking to redefine its place in a rapidly changing world. Just miles away, in the sacred halls of the imperial palace, Emperor Naruhito prepared for a moment that would transform him from crown prince to the living symbol of Japan's eternal spirit. This was not merely a ceremonial handover of power. It was a convergence of East and West, ancient ritual and contemporary diplomacy, personal transformation, and national identity. What unfolded over those extraordinary days in Japan would test the boundaries of tradition, challenge the meaning of modern monarchy, and create unexpected bonds between two men whose lives have been shaped by duty, sacrifice, and the relentless scrutiny of public life. This is the true story of how a British prince became witness to one of the most significant royal ceremonies of the 21st century, and how that experience would forever change his understanding of leadership, legacy, and the delicate balance between preserving the past and embracing the future. The rain drummed steadily against the windows of Clarence House as Prince Charles reviewed the thick briefing papers one final time. October 2019 had arrived with its characteristic British gloom, but his mind was already thousands of miles away in Tokyo, where preparations for Emperor Naruhito's enthronement ceremony were reaching their crescendo. The invitation to attend had arrived months earlier, elegantly calligraphed in both Japanese and English, bearing the chrysanthemum seal that had represented Japanese imperial power for over a millennium. Charles had always been fascinated by Japan. His first visit as a young man in the 1970s had opened his eyes to a culture that seamlessly blended ancient wisdom with technological innovation. Now, at 71 years of age, he was returning not just as the Prince of Wales, but as the personal representative of Queen Elizabeth II to witness one of the most significant royal ceremonies in decades. The weight of this responsibility sat heavily on his shoulders as he prepared for the journey that would take him halfway around the world. The flight preparation alone was a masterclass in diplomatic precision. Every aspect of the journey had been coordinated between Buckingham Palace, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and their Japanese counterparts. The timing was crucial. Charles would need to arrive with enough time to adjust to the 12-hour time difference while maintaining the energy and focus required for the intensive schedule of ceremonial events and bilateral meetings that awaited him. As the royal aircraft lifted off from London, Charles settled into his seat and opened a leather-bound folder containing detailed notes about the ceremony he was about to witness. The enthronement, or soakure, was not merely a celebration, but a sacred ritual that would formally transform Crown Prince Naruhito into emperor. This was only the second such ceremony most Japanese citizens would witness in their lifetimes, given that Emperor Akihito had reigned for over 3 decades before his unprecedented abdication earlier that year. The significance of this moment extended far beyond Japan's borders. In an era where monarchies around the world faced increasing questions about their relevance and purpose, the Japanese imperial institution represented something unique, a throne that traced its lineage back over 2,600 years, making it the world's oldest continuous hereditary monarchy. For Charles, who had spent his entire adult life preparing for his own eventual coronation, there were profound lessons to be learned from observing how Japan approached this transition of power. During the long flight, Charles reflected on the remarkable circumstances that had led to this moment. Emperor Akihito's decision to abdicate had been unprecedented in modern Japanese history. The last emperor to step down voluntarily had done so over 2 centuries ago. Akihito's reasons were deeply personal, yet profoundly public. At 85, he felt he could no longer fulfill his duties with the vigor and dedication the role demanded. His televised address to the nation in 2016, expressing his concerns about his advancing age and declining health had moved millions of Japanese citizens and sparked a national conversation about duty, sacrifice, and the human cost of imperial service. Charles understood these pressures intimately. He had spent decades as heir apparent, longer than any previous Prince of Wales in British history. The questions that had surrounded Akihito's later years about aging, capability, and the appropriate time to pass on responsibility were ones that Charles himself had contemplated. Watching Japan navigate this transition offered a unique perspective on how modern monarchies could evolve while maintaining their essential character and purpose. The aircraft carried more than just the Prince of Wales on this journey. His delegation included senior diplomats, security personnel, and cultural attaches, each playing a crucial role in ensuring that Britain's participation in the ceremony would strengthen the already robust relationship between the two nations. The United Kingdom and Japan had been allies for over a century, their partnership tested and strengthened through 2 world wars and countless diplomatic challenges. As the plane crossed continental Europe and began its journey over the vast expanse of Asia, Charles turned his attention to the ceremonial aspects of what lay ahead. The enthronement ceremony would take place in the Sidon State Hall of the Imperial Palace, a space that few outsiders had ever seen. The ritual itself would be conducted entirely in Japanese, following protocols established over centuries of imperial tradition. Charles had been studying the basic elements of the ceremony, understanding that while he would be an honored guest, he would also be a witness to something deeply sacred and uniquely Japanese. The Takamikura, the ancient throne on which Naruhito would be officially installed, had been specially transported from Kyoto, where it normally resided in the imperial palace there. This throne, made of black lacquered wood and decorated with elaborate carvings, had been used for enthronement ceremonies for over 1,000 years. The fact that it was being brought to Tokyo specifically for this ceremony underscored the extraordinary nature of the event Charles was about to witness. The diplomatic implications of his attendance were equally significant. In a world increasingly divided by trade disputes and political tensions, the gathering of world leaders in Tokyo represented an opportunity for quiet diplomacy and relationship building. Charles knew that alongside the formal ceremonies, he would have opportunities for informal conversations with other heads of state and government representatives that could prove valuable for British interests in the post-Brexit era. As the aircraft began its descent toward Tokyo's Haneda Airport, Charles could see the sprawling metropolis spread out below him in the early morning light. The city that had been devastated during World War II had rebuilt itself into one of the world's most important capitals, a symbol of Japan's remarkable post-war transformation. Somewhere in that urban landscape, final preparations were being made for a ceremony that would capture global attention and mark a new chapter in one of the world's oldest monarchies. The landing was smooth, and as Charles prepared to disembark, he felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and responsibility that accompanied such significant diplomatic occasions. He was not just attending a ceremony. He was representing his mother, his country, and the institution of monarchy itself at a moment of historic transition. The conversations he would have, the relationships he would build, and the observations he would make over the coming days would all contribute to Britain's ongoing engagement with one of its most important global partners. The Japanese officials who greeted him at the airport were impeccably courteous, their bow-accompanied welcomes reflecting the deep respect for protocol that would characterize every aspect of his visit. As his motorcade pulled away from the airport and headed towards central Tokyo, Charles watched the city come alive around him. Ordinary Japanese citizens beginning their daily routines, seemingly unaware that they were living through a moment that would be remembered for generations to come. The Imperial Palace emerged from Tokyo's urban landscape like a verdant island, its traditional walls and moats creating an almost mystical separation between the ancient world of the emperors and the pulsing modernity of contemporary Japan. As Prince Charles's motorcade approached the palace gates, he was struck by the seamless way the compound seemed to exist both within and apart from the city that surrounded it. Here, beneath the canopy of carefully tended trees and beside meticulously maintained gardens. The final preparations for Emperor Naruhito's enthronement were taking place with precision that bordered on the sacred. Charles had arrived at his hotel the previous evening and spent the night adjusting to the time difference. But nothing could have prepared him for his first glimpse inside the palace complex. The British Embassy had arranged for a private briefing session with palace officials, an extraordinary gesture that reflected the deep respect Japan held for the British royal family and the long alliance between their nations. As he was escorted through corridors that had witnessed over 150 years of imperial history, Charles found himself walking in the footsteps of his great-great-grandmother Queen Victoria's son, Prince Arthur, who had visited during the Meiji era. The palace official guiding him, a soft-spoken man named Yamamoto-san, had served the imperial household for over 3 decades. His knowledge of protocol was encyclopedic, yet he wore his expertise lightly, explaining the intricate details of the upcoming ceremony with the patient enthusiasm of someone who genuinely loved his work. As they walked through halls lined with priceless artwork and artifacts, Yamamoto-san began to paint a picture of the extraordinary complexity behind what the public would see as a seamless ceremony. The throne room, where the enthronement would take place, had been in preparation for months. Every element, from the positioning of the ancient Takamakura throne to the precise arrangement of ceremonial objects, had been planned according to traditions that stretched back over a millennium. Charles learned that the throne itself was more than just a piece of furniture. It was considered a sacred vessel, imbued with the spiritual essence of imperial authority. The craftsmanship involved in preparing it for the ceremony required skills that were passed down through generations of artisans, many of whom worked in complete secrecy to maintain the mystique surrounding imperial regalia. What fascinated Charles most was learning about the human side of these preparations. Crown Prince Naruhito, soon to become emperor, had been preparing for this moment his entire life. Yet the weight of actually assuming the role was something no amount of preparation could fully address. Yamamoto-san shared, with appropriate discretion, some insights into how the crown prince had been spending his final days before the transformation. Meditation sessions, private meetings with Shinto priests, and quiet moments with his family had filled a schedule that might otherwise have been overwhelming. The comparison to his own preparation for eventual kingship was not lost on Charles. He had spent over 50 years as heir apparent, longer than any previous Prince of Wales, and yet he knew that no amount of experience could fully prepare someone for the moment when abstract duty became concrete responsibility. Watching Japan navigate this transition offered him a unique perspective on the universal challenges faced by those born to inherit positions of such symbolic importance. During his private tour, Charles was introduced to some of the craftspeople and organizers working behind the scenes. The woman responsible for ensuring that every guest seating arrangement reflected proper diplomatic protocol had been working 18-hour days for weeks, consulting historical precedents and modern diplomatic rankings to create a seating chart that would give proper respect to representatives from nearly 200 countries. Her attention to detail was remarkable. She knew not only where each person would sit, but the cultural significance of their placement according to both Japanese customs and international diplomatic tradition. The kitchen staff preparing for the post-ceremony banquet faced equally complex challenges. The menu needed to accommodate dietary restrictions from around the world while showcasing Japanese culinary tradition. Master chefs had been experimenting with dishes that would honor both their cultural heritage and their international guests, creating fusion cuisine that respectfully bridged different culinary traditions without losing its essential Japanese character. Charles spent considerable time with the palace's cultural advisors, who helped him understand the deeper spiritual significance of what he would witness. The enthronement ceremony was not merely a political or social event. It was fundamentally a religious ritual, connecting the new emperor with a divine lineage that Japanese tradition held extended back to the sun goddess Amaterasu. This spiritual dimension added layers of meaning to every gesture, every word, every symbolic object that would be part of the ceremony. The conversation turned to the unprecedented nature of this particular transition. Emperor Akihito's abdication had been controversial precisely because it broke with centuries of tradition. Previous emperors had served until death, their departure from the throne marking not just a political transition, but a moment of national mourning. Akihito's decision to step down while still alive had required constitutional changes and sparked national debates about duty, aging, and the human cost of imperial service. These discussions resonated deeply with Charles, who had watched his own mother, Queen Elizabeth II, grapple with similar questions about duty and longevity. At 93, the Queen showed no signs of abdication, but the Japanese example offered a different model for thinking about succession and the appropriate time for power to pass to the next generation. The conversations he had during these private moments at the palace would influence his thinking about monarchy and succession for years to come. The security preparations for the ceremony were equally impressive in their scope and discretion. Thousands of personnel would be involved in protecting the hundreds of world leaders and dignitaries attending the ceremony, yet their presence would be nearly invisible to maintain the solemnity and dignity of the occasion. Charles learned about the months of planning that had gone into ensuring that security measures would not detract from the ceremony's spiritual and cultural significance. Perhaps most moving for Charles was his brief meeting with members of Emperor Naruhito's family, including his daughter Princess Aiko. The conversation was formal but warm, and Charles was struck by how the upcoming ceremony affected not just the crown prince, but his entire family. Princess Aiko, still a teenager, would soon see her father transform from crown prince to emperor, a change that would affect every aspect of their family life. The personal cost of public duty was something Charles understood intimately, having watched his own sons grow up under the intense scrutiny that came with royal life. As the palace tour concluded, Charles found himself in the palace gardens, where centuries-old trees provided shade for contemplation. The gardens themselves were works of art, carefully designed to reflect the changing seasons and provide spaces for meditation and reflection. Here, surrounded by beauty that had been cultivated for generations, Charles began to understand more deeply the continuity that the Japanese imperial system represented. The evening before the ceremony, Charles attended a private dinner hosted by the crown prince for visiting dignitaries. The conversation was conducted in multiple languages, with skilled interpreters ensuring that cultural and linguistic barriers did not impede the flow of diplomatic courtesy. Charles found himself seated near other European royals, creating opportunities for conversations about shared challenges and experiences that would continue long after they all returned to their respective countries. These behind-the-scenes experiences gave Charles a profound appreciation for the complexity and dedication required to maintain ancient institutions in the modern world. Every person he met, from senior palace officials to the craftspeople ensuring that ceremonial objects were perfectly prepared, demonstrated a level of commitment to excellence that transcended mere professionalism. They were custodians of something larger than themselves, preserving traditions while adapting to contemporary realities. The morning of October 22, 2019, dawned crisp and clear over Tokyo, as if nature itself was participating in the historic events about to unfold. Prince Charles rose early in his suite at the Palace Hotel, the weight of the coming day settling on him like a familiar cloak. Through his windows, he could see the imperial palace in the distance, its traditional rooflines silhouetted against a sky that seemed almost impossibly blue. Somewhere within those walls, Crown Prince Naruhito was preparing for the most important day of his life, a transformation that would elevate him from heir to the living embodiment of Japan's eternal spirit. The ceremony would begin at precisely 1 o'clock in the afternoon, but Charles's day started much earlier with a final briefing from the British Embassy's protocol officer. Every detail of his participation had been choreographed with military precision. When to arrive, where to sit, how to respond to various moments in the ceremony, and what his presence would symbolize to both Japanese officials and the international audience watching around the world. This was not merely attendance at a ceremony. It was diplomatic theater of the highest order, where every gesture would be analyzed and interpreted by observers both friendly and hostile. As Charles prepared for the day, choosing his military dress uniform with its array of medals and decorations, he reflected on the extraordinary historical moment he was about to witness. No reigning British monarch had ever attended a Japanese enthronement ceremony. His presence represented not just personal respect for Emperor Naruhito, but the culmination of decades of careful relationship building between Britain and Japan. The alliance between their nations had weathered 2 world wars, trade disputes, and countless political changes, emerging stronger with each challenge. The journey to the imperial palace took place in a convoy of vehicles that moved through Tokyo streets lined with curious onlookers. Japanese citizens had gathered despite the rain that had begun to fall, their faces reflecting a mixture of excitement and reverence for what was taking place in their midst. Many held small Japanese flags, others had cameras, but all seemed to understand that they were witnessing history unfold before their eyes. Security was omnipresent but discreet. Thousands of police officers, security agents, and military personnel had been deployed to protect the gathering of world leaders. Yet their presence was designed to be as unobtrusive as possible. The Japanese government had learned from previous high-profile events that excessive security could overshadow the ceremony itself. So elaborate measures had been taken to ensure protection without compromising the dignity of the occasion. The Imperial Palace complex appeared transformed from Charles's visit the day before. What had been a place of intense preparation now hummed with the controlled energy of an event of global significance. Representatives from nearly 200 countries were arriving in carefully orchestrated waves, each delegation received with the same meticulous attention to protocol that the Japanese had perfected over centuries of diplomatic engagement. Charles's arrival at the palace was met with the deep bows and formal courtesies that marked every interaction in this setting, but he could sense an underlying current of excitement among the Japanese officials. This was their moment to showcase not just their traditions, but their nation's place in the modern world. The ceremony would be broadcast globally, watched by hundreds of millions of people who might otherwise never glimpse the inner workings of one of the world's oldest monarchies. The waiting area for distinguished guests was itself a masterpiece of diplomatic choreography. World leaders, royalty, and senior officials mingled in conversations conducted in dozens of languages, yet the atmosphere remained respectful and subdued. Charles found himself in conversation with other European royals, including King Felipe VI of Spain and King Willem-Alexander of the Netherlands, sharing observations about the extraordinary nature of what they were about to witness. The call to take their positions came at precisely 12:30, and the guests moved in carefully rehearsed formations toward the side-and-stay hall where the ceremony would take place. Charles had studied diagrams of the hall layout, but actually entering the space was overwhelming in its grandeur and solemnity. The throne room was a perfect fusion of traditional Japanese architecture and imperial symbolism, every element precisely placed to create an atmosphere of both beauty and authority. The Takamikura throne dominated the space, its ancient black lacquered wood and intricate carvings seeming to pulse with centuries of accumulated history. This was not simply a chair. It was a sacred vessel that had witnessed the investiture of emperors across more than a millennium of Japanese history. The Mikadai, the throne for the empress, sat nearby, equally magnificent in its craftsmanship and symbolic importance. Charles took his assigned position among the international dignitaries, his location carefully chosen to reflect both Britain's importance as an ally and the complex protocols that governed such ceremonies. Around him, representatives from every continent sat in arrangements that had been planned for months, each placement reflecting diplomatic relationships, historical alliances, and cultural sensitivities that only experts in international protocol could fully appreciate. The ceremony began with the sound of ancient court music, melodies that had echoed through Japanese palaces for over 1,000 years. The musicians, dressed in traditional costumes that were themselves works of art, played instruments that most of the international audience had never seen, creating an atmosphere that transported everyone present backward through centuries of Japanese culture and tradition. Emperor Naruhito's entrance was a moment of profound transformation. Charles had met him as crown prince just days before, but the man who now approached the Takamakura throne carried himself differently, bearing the weight of an institution that predated most of the world's current governments. He wore the sokutai, traditional court dress that included a black silk robe and a distinctive cap that marked his imperial status. The actual moment of enthronement was conducted entirely in classical Japanese, the ancient language of court ceremonies that differed significantly from modern spoken Japanese. Naruhito's proclamation as emperor was delivered in tones that carried both personal conviction and institutional authority. Though Charles could not understand the words, the meaning was unmistakable. He was witnessing the formal assumption of one of the world's most symbolic positions of leadership. The ceremony included rituals that few outsiders had ever witnessed. Sacred objects were presented to the new emperor, including replicas of the imperial regalia that Japanese tradition held had been passed down through the imperial line for thousands of years. The actual regalia, a sword, jewel, and mirror, were considered so sacred that their exact appearance was known only to the imperial family and a few senior priests. Throughout the ceremony, Charles was acutely aware of the television cameras that were broadcasting these images around the world. This was not just a Japanese moment. It was a global event that would be remembered and analyzed for generations to come. The decisions made about what to show, what to emphasize, and how to interpret the ceremony's significance would influence international understanding of Japan and its place in the modern world. The presence of Empress Masako added another layer of significance to the proceedings. Her journey to this moment had been marked by personal challenges and public scrutiny that Charles understood all too well. Watching her take her position on the Mikadai throne, he was reminded of the personal cost that public service extracted from those called to serve in such visible roles. Prime Minister Abe's cry of "Banzai," marking the ceremony's climax, was echoed by all present, creating a moment of collective celebration that transcended cultural and linguistic barriers. For Charles, this moment represented not just the successful completion of a ceremony, but the culmination of centuries of Japanese cultural evolution and the beginning of a new chapter in the nation's history. As the formal ceremony concluded and the guests began to move toward the reception areas, Charles reflected on what he had witnessed. This was more than pageantry or political theater. It was a living demonstration of how ancient institutions could adapt and survive in the modern world while maintaining their essential character and purpose. The lessons he had learned during these extraordinary hours would influence his thinking about monarchy, tradition, and leadership for years to come. The formal ceremony had concluded, but for Prince Charles, the most important work of his visit to Tokyo was just beginning. The hours following Emperor Naruhito's enthronement would be filled with the quiet diplomacy and relationship building that often proved more significant than the grand public gestures that captured media attention. As the distinguished guests moved from the ceremony hall to the reception areas of the imperial palace, Charles found himself at the center of a complex web of conversations that would strengthen Britain's position in Asia and deepen understanding between cultures that had been building bridges for over a century. The reception itself was a masterpiece of international hospitality. Japanese protocol officers had spent months planning an event that would allow meaningful interactions among nearly 200 delegations while maintaining the dignity and formality appropriate to such an occasion. The palace's reception halls had been transformed into spaces where ancient Japanese aesthetics merged seamlessly with the practical requirements of modern diplomatic entertainment. Charles's first significant conversation was with President Trump, who had arrived in Tokyo as part of his own state visit to Japan. The relationship between Britain and the United States was undergoing significant changes due to Brexit, and every interaction between senior British and American officials carried added weight. Their conversation, conducted in a corner of the reception hall, with magnificent Japanese artwork providing a backdrop, touched on trade relationships, security cooperation, and shared interests in the Asia-Pacific region. What struck Charles about these diplomatic exchanges was how the Japanese setting influenced their tone and content. There was something about the palace environment, with its emphasis on harmony and respect, that seemed to encourage more thoughtful and collaborative discussions than might have occurred in other settings. The Japanese concept of wa, or harmony, appeared to permeate even the international political conversations taking place within the palace walls. His conversation with President Xi Jinping of China was particularly significant given the complex relationship between Britain and China in the post-Brexit era. The Chinese leader had traveled to Tokyo for the ceremony despite ongoing tensions between China and Japan over territorial and historical issues. Their presence together at this Japanese ceremony represented a form of quiet diplomacy that would have been difficult to achieve in other settings. Charles found President Xi to be thoughtful and well-informed about British culture and history. Their conversation ranged from discussions of traditional crafts and cultural preservation to more contemporary issues of climate change and sustainable development. The Chinese leader expressed particular interest in Charles's long-standing environmental advocacy, seeing potential areas for cooperation between China's massive green energy initiatives and Britain's expertise in sustainable technologies. The conversation with President Moon Jae-in of South Korea proved equally enlightening. Korea's relationship with Japan remained complicated by historical grievances. Yet President Moon's presence at the ceremony demonstrated the pragmatic diplomacy that characterized contemporary East Asian international relations. Charles's discussion with the Korean leader touched on the shared challenges faced by constitutional monarchies and democratic republics in maintaining stability while adapting to rapid social change. Perhaps the most personally meaningful conversation for Charles was with other members of European royal families who had traveled to Tokyo for the ceremony. King Felipe VI of Spain shared insights about modernizing ancient monarchies while preserving their essential character. King Willem-Alexander of the Netherlands discussed the balance between public service and personal fulfillment that challenged all constitutional monarchs in the contemporary world. These conversations among European royals revealed common challenges that transcended national boundaries. All were grappling with questions about relevance, public service, and the appropriate role for monarchy in democratic societies. The Japanese example, with its unique blend of ancient tradition and modern adaptation, offered fresh perspectives on these universal challenges. Crown Prince Frederick of Denmark engaged Charles in a fascinating discussion about environmental leadership and the role that royal platforms could play in advancing sustainability initiatives. Their conversation took place in one of the palace gardens, where the carefully maintained landscape provided a living example of the harmony between human activity and natural systems that both men advocated in their public roles. The cultural exchanges during the reception were equally significant. Charles spent considerable time with Japanese artists and cultural figures who had been invited to represent their nation's creative achievements. A master potter demonstrated techniques that had been passed down through generations of craftspeople, creating objects of beauty that embodied centuries of artistic evolution. Watching the artist work, Charles was reminded of his own appreciation for traditional crafts and the importance of preserving skills that might otherwise disappear in an increasingly technological world. A conversation with a renowned Japanese architect revealed fascinating parallels between Japanese design principles and Charles's own advocacy for sustainable architecture. The architect explained how traditional Japanese building techniques incorporated environmental considerations that modern green building advocates were only beginning to rediscover. Their discussion sparked ideas for potential collaboration between British and Japanese architects on projects that could demonstrate the practical applications of traditional wisdom in contemporary construction. The musical performances during the reception showcased Japan's unique ability to honor tradition while embracing innovation. Classical court musicians performed pieces that dated back over 1,000 years, their instruments and techniques unchanged across generations. Yet these traditional performances were complemented by contemporary Japanese composers whose work incorporated both Eastern and Western musical traditions, creating art that was both rooted in history and relevant to modern audiences. Charles was particularly moved by his conversation with Emperor Naruhito himself during a brief private moment. The newly enthroned emperor spoke eloquently about his hopes for Japan's future and his desire to build stronger connections with nations around the world. Their discussion touched on shared interests in water conservation, environmental protection, and the preservation of cultural traditions in an era of rapid global change. The emperor's fluency in English and deep knowledge of British culture made their conversation particularly rich and meaningful. Naruhito had studied at Oxford University during his youth, and he retained fond memories of his time in Britain and deep appreciation for British academic and cultural institutions. This personal connection added warmth to what might otherwise have been merely ceremonial exchanges. Throughout the reception, Charles was struck by the Japanese approach to hospitality, which managed to be both formal and genuine. Every interaction was characterized by attention to detail and respect for guests, yet there was nothing mechanical or insincere about the courtesy shown to international visitors. The Japanese staff and officials demonstrated a level of cultural sophistication that made every guest feel welcomed and valued. The culinary aspects of the reception deserved particular attention. The menu had been designed to showcase Japanese cuisine while accommodating the dietary restrictions and cultural preferences of guests from around the world. Master chefs had created dishes that honored traditional Japanese cooking techniques while incorporating ingredients and preparations that would be familiar to international palates. Charles found himself in conversation with the head chef, who explained the months of planning that had gone into creating a menu appropriate for such a diverse gathering. Every dish had been tested and refined, every ingredient sourced from the finest producers, every preparation technique perfected to ensure that the food would contribute to rather than distract from the ceremony's significance. As the reception continued into the evening, Charles reflected on the extraordinary nature of the relationships being built and strengthened in this setting. Diplomacy at its best was about more than formal negotiations and signed agreements. It was about human connections, mutual understanding, and shared experiences that created foundations for future cooperation. The conversations he had participated in during these hours would influence British policy in Asia for years to come. Trade relationships, security cooperation, cultural exchanges, and environmental initiatives would all benefit from the personal connections and mutual understanding developed during this remarkable day in Tokyo. The final evening of Prince Charles's visit to Tokyo unfolded with a quiet intensity that had characterized the entire journey. As he stood on the balcony of his hotel suite, looking out over the vast expanse of the city that had hosted one of the most significant royal ceremonies in decades, Charles found himself processing experiences that would influence his thinking about monarchy, leadership, and cultural exchange for years to come. The neon lights and endless urban landscape of modern Tokyo seemed to pulse with the energy of a nation that had successfully bridged ancient traditions with contemporary realities. The day after the enthronement ceremony had been filled with private meetings and cultural visits that provided deeper insights into Japanese society and its relationship with the imperial institution. Charles had visited the Meiji Shrine, where he observed ordinary Japanese citizens paying their respects at a sacred space dedicated to the emperor who had led Japan's transformation from feudal isolation to modern nationhood. Watching families, business people, and students participate in traditional rituals of respect and reverence, Charles gained a better understanding of how the imperial system remained relevant to contemporary Japanese life. His visit to Tokyo University had been particularly enlightening. Meeting with students and faculty members, Charles engaged in frank discussions about the role of traditional institutions in modern democratic societies. The students asked probing questions about the relevance of monarchy in the 21st century, challenges that Charles had been grappling with throughout his decades as heir apparent. Their perspectives, shaped by Japan's unique history and rapid modernization, offered fresh insights into the universal challenges facing inherited leadership in democratic contexts. The university visit had also included a symposium on climate change and sustainable development, topics that have been central to Charles's advocacy work for decades. Japanese researchers and policymakers shared their approaches to environmental challenges, revealing innovative solutions that could potentially be adapted in other countries. The conversation reinforced Charles's belief that environmental issues required international cooperation that transcended political and cultural boundaries. One of the most personally meaningful aspects of his visit had been the time spent with members of the Japanese imperial family in informal settings. These private moments, away from the cameras and protocol requirements, revealed the human cost of imperial service that Charles understood intimately. Princess Aiko, Emperor Naruhito's daughter, was navigating the complexities of growing up in the public eye while pursuing her education and personal development. Her experiences resonated with Charles's memories of watching his own sons face similar challenges. The conversations with Emperor Naruhito during these private moments had been particularly valuable. The new emperor spoke candidly about his hopes and concerns for Japan's future, his desire to modernize the imperial institution while preserving its essential character, and his commitment to using his platform to advance causes like environmental protection and international understanding. Charles recognized in Naruhito a kindred spirit who understood the delicate balance between personal conviction and institutional responsibility. Empress Masako's journey to the throne had been marked by personal challenges and public scrutiny that Charles found deeply familiar. Her background as a diplomat who had given up a promising career to marry into the imperial family reflected sacrifices that members of royal families around the world understood all too well. Their conversations touched on the importance of maintaining personal identity while fulfilling public duties, a challenge that had shaped both of their lives in profound ways. The visit to traditional craft workshops in Tokyo had reinforced Charles's appreciation for the preservation of artisanal skills in an increasingly technological world. Master craftspeople demonstrated techniques for creating ceramics, textiles, and metalwork that had been passed down through generations of families. These artists embodied the Japanese approach to excellence and dedication that Charles had observed throughout his visit. Their work represented more than mere craftsmanship. It was a form of cultural preservation that maintained connections to wisdom and beauty that might otherwise be lost. Charles had been particularly moved by his visit to a traditional tea ceremony school, where he participated in rituals that exemplified Japanese aesthetics and philosophy. The ceremony itself was a meditation on beauty, respect, and the proper relationship between humans and nature. Every gesture, every object, every moment of silence contributed to an experience that was both deeply spiritual and profoundly cultural. For Charles, who had long appreciated the importance of ritual and ceremony in creating meaning and continuity, the tea ceremony represented a perfect example of how ancient practices could remain relevant and meaningful in contemporary life. The economic discussions during his visit had revealed the potential for expanded British-Japanese cooperation in the post-Brexit era. Business leaders from both countries had participated in forums that explored opportunities for increased trade, investment, and technological collaboration. Charles's presence at these events had helped to signal British commitment to strengthening relationships with Asian partners, demonstrating that royal diplomacy could play a valuable role in advancing national economic interests. The security briefings he had received during the visit had provided insights into the complex challenges facing both nations in an increasingly unstable international environment. Japan's position in East Asia, with tensions involving China, North Korea, and historical grievances with various neighbors, required careful diplomatic balancing that Britain could learn from as it navigated its own post-Brexit relationships. The conversations with Japanese security officials had revealed common interests and potential areas for enhanced cooperation between the two nations' intelligence and defense communities. As Charles prepared to depart Tokyo, he reflected on the personal transformation he had experienced during this remarkable visit. Witnessing Emperor Naruhito's enthronement had provided him with new perspectives on the challenges and opportunities facing constitutional monarchies in the modern world. The ceremony itself had demonstrated how ancient institutions could adapt and evolve while maintaining their essential character and purpose. The relationships he had built during the visit would prove valuable for years to come. The personal connections with other world leaders, the cultural exchanges with Japanese artists and intellectuals, and the deepened understanding of Japanese society and values would all contribute to stronger British-Japanese relations in the future. These human connections often proved more durable and valuable than formal agreements or public declarations. The media coverage of his visit had been overwhelmingly positive, both in Britain and Japan. British newspapers had praised his representation of the Queen and the dignity with which he had participated in the historic ceremony. Japanese media had noted his respectful engagement with their culture and traditions, seeing his presence as validation of Japan's importance on the world stage. The soft diplomacy represented by his attendance had achieved objectives that might have been difficult to accomplish through traditional diplomatic channels. The flight back to London provided time for reflection on lessons learned and experiences gained. Charles found himself thinking about the contrast between Emperor Naruhito's approach to his new role and his own long preparation for eventual kingship. The Japanese model of abdication, while unprecedented in recent history, offered an alternative approach to succession that prioritized institutional vitality over personal attachment to power. The environmental initiatives he had observed in Japan offered practical models for sustainable development that could potentially be adapted in other contexts. The Japanese approach to balancing economic growth with environmental protection demonstrated that these goals were not necessarily contradictory, a message that Charles had been advocating for decades but had seen implemented more successfully in Japan than in many other developed nations. As the aircraft approached British airspace, Charles was already planning follow-up initiatives that would build on the relationships and insights gained during his Tokyo visit. Cultural exchange programs, business partnerships, academic collaborations, and environmental initiatives would all benefit from the foundations laid during these extraordinary days in Japan. The visit had accomplished its diplomatic objectives while providing personal enrichment that would influence Charles's approach to his public duties for years to come. The experience of witnessing Emperor Naruhito's enthronement had been more than a ceremonial obligation or diplomatic courtesy. It had been a masterclass in how ancient institutions could maintain relevance and purpose in a rapidly changing world. For Prince Charles, who had spent his entire adult life preparing for his own eventual coronation, the lessons learned in Tokyo would prove invaluable as he continued his journey toward the throne and contemplated the legacy he hoped to leave for future generations.